can hear you pouring.
It just keeps. How big's your cup? It just
It's an
keeps
enormous.
going and going.
Pouring it very slowly.
Oh boy. Well, this is the One Accord Podcast, back with another episode in our Biblical Theology project. Up on the agenda for today is Genesis chapters 19 and 20. A lot of interesting things to talk about. In many ways, sometimes a controversial passage, and I look forward to discussing that with our normal team. So let's go ahead and bring in Greg and Eric. Eric, how you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing good. Doing good. I am. I feel like I'm well prepared for this discussion. Hopefully I'm well prepared and have some good things to contribute today.
We all hope that you have some good things to contribute.
We do.
Thanks for doing your preparation. Greg, how about you? Eric's often doing maybe slightly better than you, but I don't know. You haven't said that you're doing like awesome or excellent in a while.
I'm fantastic. I'm completely
fantastic.
I'm completely unprepared for this conversation. And instead of adding anything valuable, I'm just going to make fun of Eric the whole time.
You are in rare form today. So anyway, we I don't believe that you're unprepared, though. That part, I think that maybe you're jesting with us.
A bit.
All right.
I was awake at 4 a.m. this morning, and so I've had hours to think of ways to derail this conversation.
Are you still being thrown off by the time change? I mean, it's time for you to get over it, right?
This other thing. No, the time. I'm also at the time change now. So.
All right. Well, it is good to see you guys this morning. Why don't we go ahead and dive right in? Genesis chapter 19 records one of the more well-known chapters in the book of Genesis. It describes the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so let's get into it. I know a lot of people talk about this passage. Why did God destroy these cities?
There are some who would say that God destroyed Sodom not because of their sexual practices, but because they were guilty of social injustice, oppressing the poor. And that was primarily why God destroyed these cities. And this argument actually comes from Ezekiel 16 and verse 49, and it says, "Behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had arrogance, abundant food, and careless ease, but she did not help the poor and needy." So that's the verse that's used to prove that social injustice was primarily the sin that Sodom was guilty of. Now that's certainly true. It does say that. There's no question that Sodom was guilty of that. The problem, though, is there's a couple problems. And the first is that if you just read the very next verse, it says, "Thus they were haughty and committed abominations before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw it." Now, the word abominations is interesting because it doesn't apply to like every single, sin there is. It does apply to more than one sin, of course, but abominations very often, it can apply to idolatry, or it can apply to sexual immorality, things like that. And I find that if verse 50 is talking about abominations, and the Genesis 19 with the point that it's making, I think in that chapter, the main sin that's being revealed is the sodomy of those in Sodom. I think that the abominations has to be talking about that, or at least that's at least one of the things that's in view here. If you read, just a casual reading of Genesis 19 makes it clear that homosexuality was rampant in Sodom. So I think it's a mistake. First of all, it's a mistake to say that social injustice wasn't going on, but it's also a mistake to say that social injustice was the only thing that was going on, and God wasn't concerned about the homosexuality in that city, because clearly that's in view here.
Yeah, in not earning myself a demerit, I'm going to go back to chapter 18. Chapter 18, verse 21 of Genesis says that their sin was exceedingly grave, right? And now, again, I want to honor what's said in Ezekiel, but I do want to acknowledge that Ezekiel's written hundreds and hundreds of years after these events here and after this was recorded for us. And so what I want to do is honor the text and say, okay, if their sin if the sin of Sodom, sin that kind of infected the society there, was exceedingly grave, fair enough. We can agree on that at least, right? Now, what does the text show us? What does the author of this book demonstrate for us? Do these angels roll into town and they see oppression of the poor? Do they see social injustice? Maybe you can try to make that about that. But what we are clearly shown is perverse sexual immorality. And so what I want to recognize is, like we see in Romans 1, won't quote it, but go read Romans 1 if you'd like. Sin metastasizes, right? It spreads out. So I have no reason to doubt, even if Ezekiel hadn't told me, that there were other things going on in Sodom besides just sodomy. But what Scripture clearly, the picture we get clearly painted for us in chapter 19, after reading in chapter 18 that their sin was exceedingly grave, was this gross perversity. And so I won't rule out what else Ezekiel has to tell me, but I'm definitely not going to exclude what's demonstrated clearly after we're told their sin is exceedingly grave.
Well, you both earned a demerit for referring forward. I know you didn't read Romans 1, but
whatever. Okay, I'll take 2.
But going back to Genesis 18:20, like you said, that their sin is exceedingly grave. Even before that, back in Genesis 13:13, it said that the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly. And so the author of Genesis, Moses, has been pearling or kind of developing this theme that now we're finally seeing this judgment coming about in Genesis 19. And yeah, I think you guys have said it well, so I just will state my agreement. I think that anybody who tries to make it about one particular issue, as if this was a group of people that was largely fine except for this one thing, doesn't seem to be the case. And Greg, I like the way your terminology. I don't know if you made that up or if you've heard that somewhere. I don't think I've ever heard that, but that idea of sin metastatizing, it's a good image, that sin compounds upon sin, that people get more and more sinful as we harden our hearts more and more against the Lord, as we turn more and more against Him. And we saw that descent earlier on, right? That's what we talked about leading up to the flood, is that we saw that God had looked at the wickedness, and it was great on the earth because people they were really corrupting all their ways. And so Sodom seemed to have been doing that again. And so, yeah, if you focus on just maybe the particular, sexual acts or whatever, these guys come into town, and it is, Lot, he does not want them to sleep in the open square. He says, you cannot be out here. This is not like this was some consensual thing that was going on. There was a violent mob action. So that is injustice. That's violence. It's aggression. And so you bring all these things in together. And certainly the description that we then read later in Ezekiel, and what we read in Romans, all of this stuff, of course, agrees with that. And so, yeah, I would agree with you guys. I don't want to focus necessarily on any one particular thing. Certainly these things stand out. But the thing that stands out to me most, and this is actually the next item on our list, so this will be a transition. Of course, if you guys have more to say, feel free to do so. But the thing that stands out most to me is what Lot does. Lot offering his daughters. That is such an alarming reaction. I have daughters myself. I just can't even get my head around what's going on here.
That is shocking. It's shocking, I think, because of the differences in culture. But it's also just shocking because, this is, Lot's children we're talking about, and that's just a completely different level of vileness, I guess. But Lot apparently recognized that the men that he was sheltering were foreigners from another country. I don't know at what point he recognized that they were angels from God. I'm not sure if you guys know that, but it's not crystal clear to me. If and when Lot knew. He knew it eventually, obviously, because they were saying we're sent here to judge the city or to see how bad it is, so God can judge the city. We know that, but I'm not sure exactly what moment Lot realized these were angels. But anyway, we know that he recognized that these men were foreigners from another country. He recognized that right away. And knowing how vile the men of Sodom were, he felt obligated to protect them. And because they were staying in his home, He was willing to do whatever it took to keep them safe, even if that meant offering his virgin daughters to the mob. I think my I haven't studied this in depth, but I think my suspicion is that in this culture, hospitality was a big deal, and there were very, very high expectations when it came to hospitality. Like if someone came under your roof, it was almost like, you treated them as your own family, and you did whatever it took to, um, to protect them and to make sure they were, fed and everything else. So I'm getting a feel for the culture in that time, and I think Lot was probably, while the people of Sodom may not have had that kind of culture, it looks like they didn't, but at least Lot did. Maybe where Lot came from, that was how strangers, foreigners were treated.
I have no doubt that what Lot is deciding to do here is probably coming from a desire to do good, to exercise hospitality as would be appropriate. But I definitely do not see this as a righteous compromise. I don't read this and go, wow, yeah, like that's the best way forward. I don't think the text tells us this, but what I find interesting is further in this chapter, we look at Lot and we go, is Lot a good guy? Is Lot a bad guy? Like, what is this good or bad? I find it interesting. Verse 29, thus it came about when God destroyed the cities of the valley that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot lived. It's interesting to me that God isn't recognizing or remembering or observing Lot and going, hey, Lot, by your righteousness or because of your righteousness, I'm leading you out. Because of my relationship with you, I'm leading you out. Instead, it's his relationship with Abraham, the Lord's relationship with Abraham, in which he does this thing for Lot. And I think that ought to be telling to us.
I think that's a really good point. If we go back to our discussion from our previous episode in Genesis 18, when God was describing to Abraham what he was about to do, and Abraham was interceding, he was pleading with the Lord not to sweep away the righteous with the unrighteous. And so it is seeming, though, that it was setting us up for this, that somehow Lot was righteous enough to be rescued. And, not to earn myself a demerit, but later on in Scripture, we do see Lot described as righteous Lot. And so I'll take a demerit for that, I guess. But God remembering Abraham, I think, is a very good point. And so we've talked about with Abraham before. We'll talk about it more later on in this discussion. But it's really, I don't know, starting to, hopefully, if you're not familiar with the Scripture, hopefully it's really starting to just kind of hit you with the weight of it, that these people that God is using, even when he's picking, none of them are perfect. These are very deeply flawed human beings in many, many ways. And we'll kind of keep that in our mind for one of the last items on our discussion for today. But I'm with you, Greg. I do not think that this is, I think anybody who would try and twist this and say that this is some sort of righteous compromise or that this is a more righteous thing, like it just seems like a really wicked act. And I don't know, when you're in a really terrible situation, sometimes you don't have any good options before you. I'm not trying to let him off the hook, though. This is a disturbing passage, and I think that Eric, you mentioned some of the cultural things, certainly about hospitality. Hospitality was a much bigger deal for them, and it still is in many Middle Eastern places, much bigger deal than it is for us, even in the modern day. But boy, I don't know that any original reader or any culture would read this and go, yeah, we should offer our dog. Like maybe there is, like I say, maybe that's just so far outside of my context, but I still read this as if it is something that Lot was doing something pretty nasty. Even when they're trying to save him, he hesitates in chapter 19, verse 16. He hesitates, and so he's not being viewed as this wonderful, righteous character that's just doing everything right. And then when that statement comes along that you're bringing up, Greg, about God remembering Abraham, it might seem like, maybe this is the most righteous guy in the city, but that's probably not saying a lot. You can be the most righteous guy.
It's saying something, but it's not saying. Yeah, I wouldn't want to set Lot up as the example for Christians to follow.
I'm not sure that he's meeting the same criteria as like Noah was, for example, if that makes sense. So Eric, it looked like maybe you had something else you're about to add.
Well, I think we get hung up on the word righteous because we think righteous means always doing right, no matter what. And, there were there are righteous people mentioned in Scripture. They're called righteous, and yet we know that they were flawed.
Abraham, right? I mean, we don't have to go far.
Abraham's another example. Yeah, there's others. So I think righteous. Yes, righteous has a practical aspect. He who does what is right is righteous. That is true, but I don't think righteous doesn't mean you always do the right thing and you never make a mistake. I think that's a mistake to interpret it in that way.
Yeah, and that's why I'm willing to say, like, I think Lot probably had the best of intentions. I'm not convinced that offer of his daughters was the best, and I'm willing to say I don't know what the best was. Like me, I'd be like, grab my sword, let's go to war. And now again, maybe that's not the best, but that's, if I were Lot, somebody would be reading then Greg Lot took his sword and went out swinging, right? And we'd all go, oh wow, look how unrighteous and unfaithful he is. So by no means am I saying do I know what the best is. I just don't think this was it, in my opinion.
No doubt. It is difficult to think about even just a situation like this. I mean, none of us live in a town, no matter how wicked and corrupt the city we might live in currently, we do not have all of the residents of this town coming to beat down our door to try and forcibly, I mean, they wanted to have their way with these guys. It's a situation that's so far away from my context that you read, and it's shocking. And, the Bible is very clear about the unrighteousness that it's describing. And, going back to what you brought up with Romans 1, places don't start here, but we can get there, and any culture can get there. And so when you start to, people make the slippery slope argument, or, you're opening the door to certain things. The
slippery slope fallacy is only a fallacy when you're not sliding down a slippery slope. When there is a slippery slope there, guess what? It's no longer a fallacy. It's just a reality. You just don't like the reality.
For those who believe in the inherent goodness of humanity, that doesn't seem to be the picture that the Bible is presenting. The more that we forget about the Lord, the worse things get. How quickly we get there might be different, but that seems to be the overall picture that we've been seeing up through these first 19 chapters of Genesis as we've been covering. I mean, maybe you guys are viewing it different than that, but if you forget the Lord, if you stop thinking about the Lord or trying to do things the Lord's way, you end up in situations like this, and eventually the Lord he'll have enough. I mean, are you guys, you're shaking your head yes, so I mean, you guys view it any different than that?
Yeah, no. Preach it.
I agree.
Yeah. So God does, though, in his kindness, offer to provide some salvation. So these angels tell Lot how he can be saved. He tells his household, his son-in-laws think that he's jesting or kidding around, so they don't take him seriously. And so Lot and his wife and his daughters are initially rescued, but then Lot's wife looks back. She didn't follow the instructions and turns into a pillar of salt. This is an interesting and strange account. I think that some people read this and go, oh, here's one of those reasons why people go, how do you guys think this is history? This clearly sounds like some ridiculous, absurd nonsense. What do you make of this judgment on Lot's wife? She almost gets rescued and then looks back and turns into a pillar of salt.
The reason this happened is because Lot's wife disobeyed the angel's command in verse 17 to not look behind. And she had, I guess the way that I reasoned through this, she had turned back to Sodom in her heart. And as a consequence, she shared the fate of those in Sodom in a way. There are at least two explanations for how Lot's wife became a pillar of salt. There are more than this, but this is the one. These are the two that I found to be like the most compelling, I guess. The first is that God instantly changed her into a pillar of salt as an act of judgment. And this would explain how she became a pillar as opposed to just a mound. If she had looked back and just died and fallen to the ground, well, then that wouldn't explain how she became a pillar of salt. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but this is kind of how I'm thinking. There's another possibility, and that is that she died from inhaling the fumes from the fire and brimstone. She maybe, got too close or something, and her body became encrusted with salt over time as it was lying on the ground. Now, the weakness, though, of this second view is that if she died this way, if she breathed in the fumes and she fell over and died, then she would have fallen over and became more of like a mound rather than a pillar. So I guess I'm just trying to be faithful to the language that's used. And my guess is that I think God may have just instantly done this to her as an act of judgment. So I could be wrong about that. There's more than one possibility.
So you'd made the argument that I've heard often, right? That she looked back in her heart, and maybe that's the case, right? Like, as I read this text, I don't know if this looking back was some sort of emotional, some sort of longing for. I don't see it saying that. So while I don't want to say that's not what happened, what it says is she looked back, and what the angels have said is don't look back. And so I want to leave it as simple as that, without closing the door to this, this looking back in desire. Maybe the grammar, maybe the Hebrew has that meaning buried within it. I just don't know that to be the case. As far as like how it happened, goodness, I don't know that I've ever interacted with like the actual mechanics of, an argument regarding the actual mechanics. Like, I don't know. To me, God did it. Like, that's what happened. He turned her into a pillar of salt right there. And so I understand, and I guess I can to some extent appreciate our desire to want to like give natural explanations to this. So, she died, and over time her body became encrusted. Like, man, I'm perfectly willing to let this be a very supernatural event, because as far as I'm concerned, raining down fire and brimstone is a pretty supernatural event. So why would I accept one and not accept another? Yeah. So I just give a very plain reading without asking a whole lot of questions about the mechanics.
I tend to read it more like you, Greg, but I appreciate the thoughts and comments that Eric's bringing. There are a lot of people who have done a lot more work on the, how these things might have happened, or how God perhaps did it through the processes that he's ordained or something like that. And again, I often hear those and go, that sounds interesting. But at the end of it, I'm still more like you. I just like, okay, God turned her into a pillar of salt. She didn't follow the instructions. And that seems to be the most important point to me. We saw God offering salvation to Noah, and he said, build an ark, and Noah did it exactly as God said. And so then they were saved. Here now, another plan of salvation is offered, and it is not heeded. The Hebrew word that's used, it's the same word that's used, I think, in, I just had it, where'd it go? Genesis 15, 5, when God tells Abram to look toward the heavens and count the stars. And so the NET actually translates it, but Lot's wife looked back longingly. That's the closest thing you're going to get, at least that like her heart was doing it,
okay,
that she was identifying with it. And you could do the word study yourself of this particular Hebrew word, of whether if it is kind of a longing look, or whether it's just an intent gaze. People, when you're on the freeway and there's an accident, people look, and I don't know that they're longing for it, but they kind of have this
look interestingly or interesting.
Yeah, someone's called it before the fascination with abomination, right? People, they're willing to slow down themselves and everybody else to kind of try and see, what is it that you're hoping to see in the carnage of
that train wreck phenomenon. Yeah.
And so, if this is an intense thing that's going on, I mean, fire and brimstone are raining down from heaven. If you take this as a historical event, you would be taking an awful lot to not look back and see what's going on behind you. If you were running from a tsunami, or you're running from a meteor that's falling on the ground or something like that, to only look forward and not look at what's behind you would be a real exercise in self-control.
And that doesn't even speak to a desire to go back there, right? That's just a desire to see what's happening,
see what's going on. Or I mean, are we keeping ahead of whatever's going on behind us? And so I've never been persuaded by the looking back in her heart kind of argument, although it's possible. Like I say, this is one of those things that that's not how I read it necessarily, but there is potentially some even exegetical ammunition. It certainly doesn't say she looked back in her heart, but the NET Bible, the New English Translation, has some information about that, and anybody who's interested or
I'd be tempted to. I mean, if I knew that behind me as I'm running away, fire and brimstone's raining down, not because I want to go back to Sodom, but I'd be very interested to go, hey, is this catching up? What's this look like? So all those things are it's an equally reasonable argument in my mind.
I mean, to live somewhere and to have it your home for a long time or for however long, it really isn't all that hard to believe that she didn't want to leave. And when she had to leave, you know, she felt in her heart that, she wanted to go back. And I mean, not that she could because it was obliterated, but also like, in the beginning, the angels have to practically drag them out of there. They don't want to leave. Like they're planted firmly there. And when the angels, it says the angels literally took them by the hands and practically dragged them out of the place. So to me, it's not really that far fetched to say that
And please
she
don't hear me
longs
saying,
to be
yeah,
there.
don't hear me saying that I think your idea is far fetched. Often when I hear this interpreted, this is because she wanted what Sodom had to offer. Like she was a sodomite in her heart kind of thing. And listen, if that's the case, again, I
wouldn't go that far.
Well, but often that's the tone. She looked back longingly, right? Well, if you're looking back at Sodom longingly, you have this affinity for the things. So while that very well may be the case, I don't see that as the explicit teaching of this narrative section.
Sure. And I add one other thing about her becoming a pillar of salt. I side with you guys, and I think the most likely interpretation is that God changed her into a pillar of salt. But the Bible never actually says that he did. At least not in this text. There's no verse that says God's the one that did this. Actually, what it says is she looked back, she became a pillar of salt. It doesn't say God did it.
She looked and she became a pillar of salt. So who? Yeah, okay.
I suppose the word became, the word it became, I don't know that it means instantly, although that's how I take it. I think that's the most natural way to take it, because if it says she was a pillar, which assumes that she was standing straight up when she was changed. Now, could I be wrong? Well, my understanding of a pillar is that they stand straight up. If it's some other kind of pillar, I don't know. But I think if she was standing up, then her transformation had to have been instant, which would make it seem like God's the one that did it.
Who else?
Who else what?
Who else? What, like, where is that very supernatural effect coming from, if not God?
Well, another possibility is when it says she became, again, it may not mean instantaneously. But again, I haven't looked at the Hebrew.
She very slowly walked across the field and became a pillar of salt. That's even more supernatural.
Well, like, the Kyle and Delitzsch Old Testament commentary, one of the most respected commentaries there is, and that doesn't make it correct, but I'm just saying they take it to mean that she died, she breathed in the fumes or something like that, she fell over dead, and then her body became encrusted with salt. So
yeah, and again, I just hear that and I
can't prove that, but that's what they said.
I will 100% grant that is a possibility from this text. But I hear that and I go, that sounds to me like a 20th century or 21st century. We need to have a more natural explanation for this thing that sounds very supernatural, because we're very uncomfortable with supernatural. That's what
and that
might not be the case at all. But that's what it sounds like in my ears. We have to have a natural explanation for this, because this is too far over the edge.
Sure, and I completely understand that. And like I said, I actually side with the first view that it was God who did it. So I'll just leave it at that.
So this is one of those interesting areas where, as I listen to both you guys talk, and again, I appreciate that you're not, hostile towards one another or something like that. But sometimes Christians, they have a different view of this, and some go, well, no, clearly, obviously, she was only concerned about the destruction, and she had the fascination with abomination. It had nothing to do with her longing for it or her heart. She just was fearful. And others go, no. Obviously, it's that she loved Sodom, raised her family there, had an affinity for it. And we can divide over things that, if we're being honest, the text doesn't say either. And we can relate to either of those things. We get it. Sometimes my heart or my flesh has an affection for things that it ought not to. And sometimes my fear causes me to do things that I ought not to do. And so I can relate to both of those, and there's probably some other things. What the text is telling us is that God said, if you want to be saved from this judgment, leave and don't look back. And she looked back, and she was judged. And so what I want to take away from this as an immediate takeaway is whatever it might be that would cause us to justify why we don't listen to God, don't do that.
Yeah.
And
Amen.
maybe for you, it's fear. Well, how many times does the Bible say, fear not, don't be afraid? Fear God rather than men. Fear God rather than the other types of things that might happen in the world. How many times does God tell us to set our affections on Him, to delight in Him, to love Him with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, rather than loving the things of this world or loving whatever else? And so whatever it might be that would cause you to be distracted from what God has said and to justify, because people do this all the time. I'm sure you guys have seen this, and I'm not trying to beat up on anybody. I can do this. I hear other people do this. We come up with reasons where we justify and say, well, this is why, and here's my reasonable explanation for why I didn't do what God told me to do. Well, Lot's wife, whether it was instantaneously or a process, whether it was out of fear or affection or some other reason, on the face of it, she didn't do what God said, and she was judged with everybody else. Only Lot and his daughters escaped because they didn't look back. And so I think that's the main takeaway from this, and I don't want to fight with people. And you guys aren't fighting. Everything you are saying sounds reasonable. I could be convinced of either of those things, and I'm sure that somebody else could provide another one. If you're watching this, put in the comments below what you think was going on. But I really think that the text is intending, maybe even leaving it ambiguous. It doesn't tell us why she looked back, I don't think. We could come up with a reason, but the fact that she looked back, that's the only thing that matters. And so when I look at my own life, sometimes, I look, if God recorded my life and say, well, why did Joe do this? Well, here's the reason. It doesn't matter. There are times when I just didn't obey God. And whatever the reason was, no matter how reasonable it sounds to you, no matter how much you can relate to that, obeying God is good and disobeying God is bad, as is being presented from the scripture. I hate to be so black and white sometimes with it, but that's the overall picture. And believers, hopefully we go, I agree. Obeying God is always a good thing. Disobeying God is always a bad thing. Non-believers, they're going, well, no, I don't want to obey God. I mean, you have to understand, of course you lie sometimes, or of course you do this or that or the other thing. Of course you look back. I get it. If I was trying to escape this, I don't know what I would have done. Just like I don't know what I would have done if this mob was banging on my door. Sure hope I wouldn't have put out my daughters. I think probably I'd go down swinging like you did, Greg. But I don't know. Maybe you'd be afraid because there's so many out there. Who knows what we would do in those situations? But what we do know is that's what she did, and as a result of her disobedience, she was judged. God's serious when He talks about judgment, and so if He provides a way of escape, as we continue to read forward, if God provides a way of escape, we ought to pay very careful attention to what He says and try and add to it, not try and take away from it, but just heed what He has said. This is how you can be saved. Noah had to build that ark, exactly like he said. She had to leave and not look back. She looked back, she didn't make it. So you guys got anything else to add on this before we move on to the next part?
Nope.
Yeah, let's go.
Let's talk about Lot and his daughters. They make it out, and then we get another disturbing scene. You guys want to paraphrase what happened here and then tell us your thoughts and comments?
Absolutely. So yeah, Lot and his daughters escape and eventually move up into mountains and caves. And again, I would say based on a lack of appreciation for how God can provide, Lot's daughters take matters into their own hands, taking turns getting their father drunk and sleeping with him, eventually, obviously getting pregnant by him. And from that, and I think this is kind of the point of the story, telling us where these two people groups came from, the Moabites and the Ammonites, which, not to, again, earn myself any more demerits, but play an important role in what's going to happen in Israel's future and would surely be informative and interesting to the original audience.
Yeah, no demerit for that. We will want to take note of these people groups and keep them in the back of our mind moving forward, because God is naming them and telling them this is their origin, and we will be shocked if they do not come up at least once again in the future. So well said. No demerit. We're paying attention to the details to keep alert for what's coming next. But Eric, what would you add?
What Greg said is basically what I have. So I honestly don't think I would even have anything to add.
Do you think, I've heard some people try and again justify this. This was not the right thing to do. These people groups that come from this doesn't seem like a good origin story, and I'll be shocked if this doesn't cause some problems down the road. But I've heard some people that, again, try and justify this. If you just saw the whole world come to an end, basically, where you lived, and your mom turned into a pillar of salt, you're living in caves now, do you think that they thought that this was like similar to the whole flood, that the whole world was ended? Or do you think that they knew that this was just their city and that there was plenty of other people? Because the way that they're talking, like, we need to preserve our lineage, It's almost like they thought that the whole world was gone, that they're literally the last three people on earth.
I guess it's a reasonable thing to consider, especially from verse 31. Our Father is old. There's not a man on earth, or my Bible has a note that says, or in the land. There's not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of the earth. So I suppose that's possible. I guess in my personal interpretation, as I've filtered this story in the past, it seems like, Lot became this, the survivalist, right? We see that in some modern day things where build a bunker and we kind of escaping out into the wilderness. And so was it that the girls couldn't have thought the entire earth, right? Because Zoar survived, and so there's at least a village, small as it might be. So I guess I don't know what they thought, but again, through my lens, my filter, as I always read this was an act of desperation out of being held up with a father who becomes some backwoods survivalist.
As I read this chapter in the past, I assumed that maybe Lot's daughters had this idea that, they were the only ones alive and no one else survived. Although if they thought that, then...
who made the wine, right?
Like, it seems like a kind of an ignorant thing to think because, well, first of all, like in Genesis 19, it says in verse 15, when morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, up, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city. The city is being punished here, not the entire world. And clearly, the context sure makes it sound like this judgment was limited to, Sodom and Gomorrah, and it wasn't so widespread that it affected the entire world. I don't know what would have made the daughters think that the whole world was obliterated, that everyone else was killed. If they thought that, then either they didn't know what God had said, either they didn't know what the angels had said, or they knew and just didn't believe it. I don't know. I don't know what they were thinking, but it does say, like in verse 31, then the firstborn said to the younger, our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of the earth. So apparently they misunderstood the situation and thought that they were it, and they had to repopulate the earth.
Well, I'm going to use a really theologically, advanced term, but as I read this, I think this is just icky. It's disgusting. It's gross, and we'll see.
Define your terms.
Ew. It's an icky thing, and just like we've seen before, when the narrative is honest, describing what happened, it's not telling us what ought to have happened. And so, just like polygamy, and we read about polygamists, isn't telling us that polygamy is something we ought to do. Likewise, this is not giving us a practice that we ought to participate in. The origin of these two people groups, as we'll see, this is not a good thing. Like the overall, the outcome of this for generations to come will not be a good thing that comes from this. And we will want to keep our eye out when we see God making more clear-cut lines of what he expects from his people, that just like polygamy is not a good or endorsed practice, likewise, this type of incestuous relationship is not something that is endorsed or should be practiced. This is not a good thing. And so, once again, we see these people being saved, but their conduct doesn't mean that we should be imitating what they're doing. Let's move on to chapter 20, unless you guys have anything else from Genesis 19.
Yeah, no, let's go.
So in Genesis chapter 20, we see Abraham telling a similar lie or half-truth that he told before about Sarah, this time to King Abimelech. Is this, Greg, you had said before that we might be seeing a pattern here.
I was so looking forward to this point of the conversation because this completely vindicates, as far as I'm concerned, my view and my argument before, right? And that, as a matter of fact, Abraham himself justifies my point of view and quite clearly.
Greg, can I say it? You were right.
Yeah. Okay, I'm good. I'm all set.
Finish your point. But you were right before.
That's really all I wanted. Actually, what I really want is Eric to say it.
He won't. No, he won't say it.
Well,
I'll cut his microphone out before he can say it.
So, when he says, this is the kindness which he's speaking up, he's reporting what he had said to Sarai, that, this is the kindness which you will show to me everywhere we go. Say of me, he is my brother. So again, not making any sort of judgment I'm not making any sort of judgment on how bad Abimelech was or whether Abimelech was righteous in the sight of God. What we have here is Abraham admitting that my plan, my proactive plan as we set out was everywhere we go, this is the lie you're supposed to give, regardless of how wicked or righteous of whatever people group we come across. So,
Eric, I mean, obviously you knew about this passage back when we were talking about the Egyptians. Does this change anything that you were saying before? I mean, you knew about this before. So any additional thoughts that you have, or do you want to just say that Greg was right and we can move on? Maybe we'll just end the whole show with that.
I can't say that.
Yeah, no, that would seem out of character for you.
I will say
just
this.
As out of character as Abraham saying, "This is my wife." You guys,
say it. Well, say it.
I will say this. This is what I will say about it. Yes, I think I said, and I don't remember how I said it, but people can watch the episode
incorrectly.
Okay. Well, what I did say was that Abraham thought that the Egyptians might, or there was a high probability that the Egyptians would take his wife and kill him. Apparently, according to the verses that you guys just read, that this was his assumption everywhere he went, that this was a very high probability. Whatever kingdom he went into, chances were that, or at least there was a chance that his wife was going to be taken, he was going to be killed. So he was suspicious of everybody. That's what the text here makes very clear. What I would say is that in verses 11 through 13, it does really make it sound like Abraham thought his actions were justified. He assumed the people of Gerar didn't fear God, and Sarah was his sister, which was a half-truth, not the whole truth, because she was his wife also. So it seems like Abraham didn't think he was doing anything wrong. And I guess the question would be, I try to keep this in context because, we have the whole Bible, right? We have the rest of the Old Testament, plus we have the New Testament. And we kind of think, well, okay, shouldn't Abraham have known better than to do this? He was dishonest because he said he was basically saying she's only my sister, not my wife, which was a lie. That was wrong. But Abraham makes this case that he was justified in doing that. And the question is, if there was no explicit law at that time condemning that behavior in those circumstances, was Abraham doing wrong? And I think, well, okay, the only thing else you could say is, would this be a matter of conscience in the sense that would this be something that your conscience would condemn you for without a written law?
And I'm sure you don't mean it this way, but it sounds like a tap dance to get away from the fact that Abraham was wrong and seemingly Abimelech was acting unknowingly. He didn't know. But,
Abimelech was acting unknowingly. I will give you that. Yes.
So when I read Abimelech's response, like what have I ever done to you? How have I sinned against you? Why would you put me in this situation? Lord, I acted in the integrity of my heart. Why are you doing this to me, Abraham? I don't have any reason why I ought to make more of Abimelech's possible wickedness, and I don't have any reason to make more of the fact that or less of the fact that what Abraham did here was wrong. He sinned against me. He said, you sinned against me, and I'm willing to let Abraham's warts be his warts and his righteousness be his righteousness. And I don't feel like I have to excuse that in any way. So thank God for Abraham. But there's a reason this story is included in the narrative of Scripture, showing his warts. And I don't think it's to try to excuse Abraham or try to make us think that Abimelech was a bad guy.
Let me say two things. The first thing is when Abimelech said that he was doing this in the integrity of his heart, all that means is that he took Sarah not knowing that she was married already.
Sure.
It doesn't mean Abimelech was a man of integrity throughout his life. It just means in this particular situation, he took her not knowing she was married.
Sure.
So I will give you that. It's plain as day in the text. Yes, Abimelech took her not knowing she was married. But I'm not justifying lying, but I would say this. Just like the argument that, well, okay, if you're hiding Jews in your basement and Nazis knock on the door, okay, is it right or wrong to lie? That's a unique situation. I think Abraham was in a unique situation here. He's
unique everywhere he went.
Well, he lived in Ur for his whole life, right? We're assuming up until the time God told him to leave. So he's going into these pagan lands and fearing for his life. And I get that. Now, should he have had even more faith and said, well, God, if I have to go into Egypt, you're going to protect me there. Or if I have to go into Gerar, you're going to protect me there. You know, for me, I think it's better to tell the truth than to lie. I get that. But I also recognize that, and I want to be careful how I say this because I don't want to seem like I'm being like, you know, like I'm saying, go ahead and break God's law. I'm not saying that. But I just think Abraham seems to have been convinced that he was doing the right thing in these situations. Now, what God thought of it, we're not exactly sure because God never rebukes Abraham. What God does say is he's pretty harsh toward Pharaoh and pretty harsh toward Abimelech, although he lets them off because he didn't let him sin against him. So I get what you're saying, and I'm not trying to say, well, go ahead and lie because the situation called for it. But what I am saying is it sounds like Abraham's conscience may have been clear when he did these things. Does that make him right in God's eyes?
I have no doubt. I mean, based on the text here, I have no doubt that Abraham justified his actions in his own mind. Yeah, I'm sure Abraham thought, I'm doing this for very good, reasonable reasons. But again, I don't think the text is trying to show us that Abraham did a good thing. I think it's clear Abraham did a bad thing. And, praise God that he restrained Abimelech from doing something worse and doing something bad. And yes, gave him the warning that like, now you do know this. So now let's not only, you were innocent, you were walking in integrity. Now let's make sure you carry on that way. Again, I don't have any reason to try to take Abraham's pre-planned, predetermined lie and try to make it less than what it is, but also not make it worse than what it is for either him or Abimelech.
Well, do you guys, and I know you would agree with this, at least I think to some extent, but this was prior to the law, right? Prior to we'll see there's going to be this law that comes on the scene in the Bible later on. This was prior to a written law. And the only law that we've seen so far, well, I take that back. It's not the only one, but it's the only one I think that's really relevant to this, is that God had moral expectations for people. One example is in Genesis 9, where God said, if a man kills another man, his blood shall be shed. The murderer shall be put to death. And then in Genesis, I think it was 18, where God told Abraham, you're to practice righteousness, and you're to teach your family, your household to practice righteousness too. So there were moral expectations. But we're looking at this having full knowledge of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so this looks, I think, more black and white to us than probably it did to Abraham. So I guess I'm not trying to defend everything Abraham did. Obviously Abraham was flawed, and we all know that. But to me, I think from Abraham's perspective, I don't see this as being as black and white because of the circumstances that he was in. So I guess that's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And I'll grant you that, sure, it might not be as black and white, but what I do want to do is affirm that God's standard of righteousness hasn't changed based upon a timeline, right? Like lying, untruthfulness is just as wicked in God's sight at this point of the story as it's going to be at the end of the story. So sure. I don't want to try to make it necessarily as black and white. Yet apparently in Abimelech's eyes, it was pretty black and white to Abimelech. What have you done? Like, what have I done to you that caused you to sin against me? Like, what? Like, why did you put me in this situation? So apparently, at least to Abimelech, and I'm going to guess to Abraham, like Abraham's like, well, yeah, I did it for, like, he's trying to excuse himself. He's providing a reason why. What he doesn't say to Abimelech is, what are you talking about? What's sin? How have I sinned against you? There's no written law. Abraham, seems to me, goes, yeah, here's why I wronged you. And he's accepting the fact that what he did was wrong, regardless of written law or no written law.
I want to introduce something additional that I don't think has really come out. What do you guys make of the fact that, Abimelech, okay, he's been lied to. It seems like the text is even affirming, yeah, and he was innocent. He was doing things in integrity. Everything that he did, based on the information that he had, was not a wrong thing. However, his ignorance of the truth did not preserve him from the fact that had he gone through with it would have been a terrible, wicked sin, and God would have judged him.
God dealt with mankind like throughout this entire period. There was maybe nobody that was completely, utterly ignorant of God's expectations. When God drowned the whole world, and Noah and his family were left, God made a covenant with mankind. Don't kill people. And he said, if you kill people, you should be killed. Your government should put you to death. So I think, there were moral expectations, and then God intervened during the Tower of Babel. I guess I don't know. There were people ignorant. Of course they were, because they didn't have the kind of revelation that would come later. Then again, they weren't totally ignorant either, because they had conscience, and there were laws, I think, even on the books, as we might say, because men were thinking about these things, and they were using their conscience to develop laws, no doubt, that they had made laws of the land. So I don't know.
It's my view that God's holiness has never, will never change. That as a creature created by the Holy One, that we are, regardless of our dispensation, regardless of our knowledge, regardless of how much information we have or don't have, we are going to be held accountable. We are going to be measured against that righteous standard, that holy standard. And thank God for Christ that I can be clothed in his righteousness, that I can turn to him. But if I had been born to some remote tribe out in the middle of nowhere that even to this day has not been touched by the gospel, I am not any less responsible or going to be held accountable as measured against the righteousness, holiness, and perfectness of God. And so regardless of what law they did or didn't have, in my mind, it's a technical question more than I don't know that it matters. God is God, man is man, and man will be judged by a righteous and holy and perfect God. Now, how much should Abimelech? I don't know. I don't know all of that. I don't know that we aren't given that. But regardless, what he was about to do was a wrong thing. And we know that it was wrong. Not only because of how Abimelech reacts, not only God tells him it's wrong here, and I can say that what Abraham was doing was also a wrong thing. Now, why was Abraham chosen and given grace and put in this special position where this guy who's just wronged you, restore his wife, and then he's going to pray for you, and that's going to be a great thing. I don't have all the answers for that, but I don't think that Abimelech is any less accountable to the holiness and righteousness of God based upon the fact that there wasn't a law yet written.
I'll say amen to that, and that's a great segue into what'll be the last issue that we'll discuss on this episode. I'm going to kind of lump together, for you guys, the last three things. They're fairly similar. As we reflect on Abraham and Lot, and we see that God is working in the lives of these two very flawed human individuals, anybody who reads through Genesis 19 and 20, if you were the one who was judging, you might make different judgments. You might decide to execute things differently. Some would accuse God of maybe some kind of divine favoritism. Others would you used the word, I think, chose. God chose. This brings up issues of election. Is God being partial? How do you handle some of these ideas of God working in the lives of Abraham and Lot in particular? Recording details that, I mean, as I read this, Lot is a very unlikable figure. He just is. Everything that he did, I'm like, man, what's this guy up to? And yet somehow he escapes judgment. Abraham keeps putting people in a position. He's seemingly, again, I'm not trying to tear Abraham down, but he's got some significant failings. And boy, I mean, Abimelech seems at least likable. I'm sure he's got failings too, but the way you read this narrative, I'm like, man, he's put in a bad spot. What do you guys make about this? And does this? I guess I'll just leave it open. And how do you interact with some of these issues?
Well, I don't know that I have a whole lot of additional information that I haven't already said, but it's hard for me because is lying wrong? Yes. Should everyone know lying is wrong? Yes. But is it different? Is lying, I'll say, less wrong in certain situations? Well, I mean, this is a question that is going to be debated among Christians. I think there are certain situations where I'll just say I think lying is maybe the lesser of two evils in certain situations. But you're right. It's totally fair argument that Abraham did put people's lives in jeopardy, and God intervened and prevented them from, committing sins that would have resulted in their death. So thank God that He was merciful to these guys. So it's a tough call, and I just bring that up because some might say, well, that's why God, had mercy on Abraham, and we don't ever read about God rebuking Abraham for any of these things. And actually, God seems to be siding with Abraham rather than the guys that were wronged. And I honestly don't know even for sure why that is. But one thing to consider, and this has kind of already been said, but God did choose Abraham and his family for a special purpose, and He was determined to bring about that purpose. And I think Abraham showed his faithfulness in different ways. And we already know what he did. I mean, he believed God. He left his family. He left his country. He believed the promise in Genesis 15. So Abraham demonstrated righteousness. Was Abraham perfect? Of course not. We all know that he wasn't. But he seemed to walk with God. He had a pattern of obedience in his life toward God. Yes, he sinned in certain situations, but I think maybe, and I'm not saying this is absolutely the truth, but maybe, God looked at his pattern of righteousness and said, okay, this guy's definitely flawed, but I can see that he's very serious about following me. And, and therefore I'm going to, choose him. I'm going to side with him in some cases over, other people, even though Abraham was in the wrong in some of the things that he did, because God had a purpose to bless Abraham's family, to make them into a great nation, and to bring the Messiah through that nation. So I think sometimes God just shows grace, maybe because He's got a plan, and His plan requires Him to show grace to fulfill that plan. So I just some food for thought.
Well, I appreciate those. Greg, we'll give you the last word on this in just a second, but I think that, in my opinion, I get uncomfortable when we start to try and have any justification for lying, or even saying it's maybe the lesser of two evils. Again, I hear what you're saying, and I'm not necessarily saying you're wrong. I have some significant pushback about that as an idea, and we can keep on looking, as we go, pay very careful attention to everything the Scriptures tell us about lying. I think where you were kind of ending is really what I would want to emphasize, and then again we'll see what Greg says. But I think that as I read through this, we're seeing not that Abraham is any better. In fact, in some cases he comes off worse. And I don't want to try and justify what he's doing and say, oh, he's better than Abimelech or he's better than Pharaoh. I think he's worse, and I think that gives me a lot of hope because God has made a promise. He has chosen this particular guy. Yes, he's believed God, but Abimelech believed God here. God told him something, and he believed God also. And I see the purpose of what God was doing. If God didn't work through flawed, sinful individuals, nobody would be saved. And so we're seeing this foundation that's going on saying, look, God's not saving Abraham because he's better than anybody else. He's saving Abraham because God delights in saving individuals. And if people will listen to him, they will be saved. And if they won't be. And so I don't know that, again, I'm not trying to tear Abraham down. I'm not even saying that I'm any better than Abraham. However, I don't have any desire, and I don't know that you do either, so I'm not attributing this to you, but I just don't have any desire to try and justify the things that he does. Lot, I'm not trying to justify anything that he did. God saved them because God is kind and he's gracious. And that is an example of his mercy. And if he didn't just pick people and say, I'm going to save them, even despite their flaws, then the Messiah never would have come. Then the blessing to all the families of earth never would have come to fruition. If God was waiting for sinless individuals or something like that, it just obviously, I think we all agree with that. So when I read these things, it just really encourages me to say, you know what? We are the kinds of people that God can use. And, when we're sinful, we shouldn't try and justify our sinful actions. We should always be living a life of repentance and saying, God, even if I'm doing this in ignorance, that's not an excuse. You got to teach me. I want to walk before you in integrity, but I thank you for your grace. Greg, you were saying it very well, kind of transitioning to this. Thank God for your grace. Thank God for Christ. Thank God for the fact that it's not about what we do. And yet because of his great love, I want to do better. And I do think that Abraham wanted to do better. It's curious. I don't know why God gave this dream to Abimelech, or why he didn't give it, say, Abraham, you got to stop lying about this. What are you doing? Putting everybody in this situation. And maybe he did, right? We don't get everything recorded. But he's being confronted by this, at least indirectly. Pharaoh said, why'd you do this? Now King Abimelech saying, why'd you do this? That should cause, I think, Abraham to rethink his policy. If we live our life, we're constantly doing things where people are like, why do you keep doing this thing that's harmful? Eventually, I don't need some divine revelation for me to start rethinking my actions. Going, I got to stop putting people in precarious situations. But in any event, I don't know that I'm not disagreeing with you, I don't think, except with maybe on the lying aspect. And again, we can both be looking, I don't know, that Satan, the adversary, is a liar, right? He's the worst figure in Scripture, and that's what he's characterized by, is lying. Lying is a horrible thing, and what I see here is Abraham put King Abimelech in a horrible situation that he didn't even know that his life was in danger. And so again, thank God for his grace to intervene and preserve him from a terrible, wicked sin. So Eric, I'll give you, if you have any thoughts on what I said, I'll let you have it, and then we'll give Greg the last word on this.
As far as lying goes, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying go ahead and lie. It's fine. Lying is a sin. It's wrong. I'm kind of, I think Greg said this, I can't help but, take into consideration all that I know outside of these verses. Like there's just so much more that could be said. Lying, it's one of those things where, like, I don't think it's always black and white. There are situations where it's absolutely black and white. Is it always? Well, but yeah, you're right. Abimelech, yeah, he put Abimelech in a very, very nasty situation, and it looks like he shouldn't have done that. So I can't argue with that. Was he more righteous than Abimelech and Pharaoh? Well, I lean toward the idea that he probably was more righteous, but
overall probably. But I'm just saying in these particular instances.
In those particular instances, it's he Abraham may have been lacking there. So I'll just leave it at that.
It seems so painful for you, brother, because I'm not going to say these verses or this divine favoritism or justice or whatever we want to label this under. I don't see this as easy, but I see it as really simple. You use the word over and over, grace. This is God being gracious right here. What should he have done to Abraham? I mean, listen, let's take the law. What should have happened? Abraham should have been put to death, right? This is in no way can we look at this and go, this is a good example of Abraham. We could probably find reasons to say that this wasn't good for Abimelech, but we see God's grace working for both of them right here, right? According to God, he, in some way, we don't need to define it, but restrained Abimelech. Why? Because of grace. What's he doing? What's God doing working with a guy like Abraham who's shown himself predetermined to go out and lie to protect his own skin? Grace. That's what's going on here. And so I praise God that we see grace. And so is it favoritism? Well, if God's going to choose anybody, if God's going to work through anyone, If he were to write the story, putting Eric back in there, maybe Eric wouldn't have done this sin. Maybe Greg wouldn't have done this. I probably would have. My wife's very beautiful. Thank you. He would have.
You told me she was your sister.
Exactly. If any story is going to be written about any human, any person that God's going to work through, if it's going to be told honestly, you're going to have something. So if it wasn't this, it's going to be something. So thank God for his grace.
Well, amen to that. Thank God for his grace. We're going to go ahead and restrain ourselves at this point. Not that there isn't more that could be said, but we'll let you, our viewer, have the last word on this if you'd like. Comment below if there's other things that you'd like to bring to this discussion. We'd love to hear your perspective on any of the things that we discussed, or if there's things that we didn't discuss that you'd like to bring up. Let us know down there, and we can keep the conversation going as we continue this biblical theology project. If you're still watching and you enjoyed this video, go ahead and click that thumbs up to let YouTube know that you like this video. You can click the share button and you can share it with other people, or you can click the thumbs down button if you hate it looking at our dumb faces, but you probably aren't at this point of the video if you hated it to this point. But in any event, go ahead and subscribe if you want to continue on this journey with us, because we got a lot more chapters to go as we go through to the end of Revelation. And until we see you next time, get equipped, obey your King, and glorify your God.
Say it, say it, say it, say it, say it, say it, say it.